Kant's moral construction applied to the Scarlet Letter.
This is our graph that depicts Hester and Dimmesdale's Kant-centric development throughout the novel. It shows the different lines that depict their morality that changes with different actions. The red line depicts Hester and the orange line depicts Dimmesdale.
In our graph, the y-axis represents the character's morality according to Kant, while the x-axis represents the succession of chapters in the novel. If a line moves below 0 on the y-axis, it indicates that there is more immorality than morality in the character's conscience. However, as both characters maintain the infinite dignity afforded by their retention of rational potential, neither descend to a value below -5, which we consider past redemption. Both Hester and Dimmesdale, one consumed outwardly by sin, one consumed by sin, struggle throughout the novel to reconcile their regret, pride, and penance. This results in an intersecting fluctuation that characterizes the majority of the graph.
First, we'd like to touch on the pinnacles that combine to form Kant's theory of morality. Kant believed that one's intent takes precedence over consequences. He said that a good will is good not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition. In other words, Kant rejects the utilitarian notion that the outcomes of actions determine the action's viability. He views consequentialism as painfully circumstantial and much too waveringly wishy-washy. Instead, he places moral value on intent, thereby creating a consistent way to analyze ethics. Of course, analyzing literary characters' intent is especially challenging because of the limitations of the form, as well as the narrator's bias, so to account for this, we've de-emphasized the importance of intent throughout our presentation, although we do return to it in the latter chapters. Another one of Kant's tenets is that morality is derived from autonomy, that is, without outside influence. For Kant, autonomy is part and parcel of rationality. For someone to act autonomously, as they must if they wish to be moral, they must act without influence from emotion or environment. Once these factors are eliminated, Kant believes all individuals will arrive at the same rational, universal law, the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is perhaps the key factor that shapes our graph, as all of Kant's theories accumulate to ground the imperative. The categorical imperative is composed of 3 formulations, which we've outlined below. As we will address throughout the video, Hester and Dimmesdale fluctuate in their adherence to the imperative, but ultimately redeem themselves with their near-to-last acts. We do, however, want to start by focusing on the dichotomy of the first formulation. Kant divides the concept of maxim universalization into perfect duties and imperfect duties. Kant declares that actions are immoral if, by the universalization of their maxim, an intrinsic contradiction arises. Humanity has an inflexible, perfect duty to perpetually avoid these actions. However, Kant also suggests that actions are laudable if, by the universalization of their maxims, an improved society is established. Humanity has a flexible, imperfect duty to perpetually perform these actions. Imperfect duties explain one of the most evident trends in our graph, the fact that Dimmesdale remains low throughout the novel, because his actions have already, in effect, been universalized. Puritan society seeks to bury sin just like he does. The society his universalized decisions creates is hypocritical and crucifies honesty, and, therefore, he has an imperfect duty to reject his actions, something he only does in the last penultimate chapter.
Pre-book. Each of them dishonors the human nature of the other. They make of humanity an instrument for the satisfaction of their lusts and inclinations. Lectures of Ethics 163. Prior to the act of sleeping together, Hester and Dimmesdale are assumed to have a fairly solid moral standing, especially because Dimmesdale is considered the pinnacle of Puritan society. However, once they give in to their desires and sleep with each other, their moral worth drops significantly. Kant is firmly against the notion of casual sex because it promotes using others as a means to the end of satisfying their own desires. Thus, they both start at a 1 on the Kantian scale.
By the first chapter of the novel, Hester has maintained her morality and Dimmesdale has decreased. By chapter 2 of the novel, Hester has increased and Dimmesdale has remained constant. It seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom. In a moment, however, wisely judging that one token of shame would but poorly serve to hide another, she took the baby on her arm and looked around at her townspeople and neighbors. At the marketplace, Hester takes her solitary stand on the scaffold, bearing her shame and guilt in front of the entire Puritan community. She clutches Pearl instinctively to her chest to cover the letter, but upon realizing the impetuous, heteronymous folly of that action, she merely holds Pearl and looks out to the community. However, because Pearl is not yet a rational being, Hester can technically use Pearl as a means to an end without violating the second categorical formulation, which puts her at a 4 on the graph. She turned her eyes downward at the scarlet letter, even touched it with a finger to assure that herself and the infant and the shame were real. Yes, these were her realities. This passage further affirms Hester's rise, as it indicates she is rejecting empirical conclusions and looking within her own rational self to determine her course of actions.
Between chapters 2 and 3, they both remain constant.
I will not speak, and my child must seek a heavenly father. She shall never know an earthly one. When Hester refuses to reveal Dimmesdale as the father of her child, her fellow adulterer, she upholds her moral standing by maintaining the promise she made with him to not reveal his sin. She will not speak, murmured Mr. Dimmesdale, who, leaning over the balcony with his hand upon his heart, had awaited the result of his appeal. Page 63. When Dimmesdale does not reveal himself as the father, he is hiding behind his sins, therefore leading to a lower standing in Kant's eyes. He is acting upon self-preservation, something frowned upon in the Kantian lens. Conversely, Dimmesdale places his hand above his heart, indicating that his self-mutilation has already begun. This further contributes to his downturn. Between chapters 3 and 4, both Dimmesdale and Hester remain constant.
In chapter 4, Hester says, "I will keep thy secret, as I have his." Page 70. Here, Hester is acting upon her duty to morality, because divulging a secret is immoral according to Kant. So by upholding both parties' secrets, whatever the consequences, Hester's intent is sound and, again, moral.
Between chapters 4 and 5, both Dimmesdale and Hester remain constant.
Here she said to herself had been the scene of her guilt, and here should be the scene of her earthly punishment. And so perchance the torture of her daily shame would at length purge her soul, and work out another purity, that which she had lost, more saint-like because of her martyrdom. Hester returns to serving society by sewing extravagant articles of clothing on for society with philanthropic intent. Her intent is purer than before, as she acts dutifully towards her fellow community members, which allows her morality to elevate on the graft.
Between chapters 5 and 7, Hester has undergone a moral decrease, whilst Dimmesdale undergoes a moral increase. Their morality intersects in chapter 7. In truth, she seemed absolutely hidden behind it. Page 94. Hester's actions seem to be dictated by the standards set by the Puritan Society when they required her to wear the scarlet A on her chest. This means that Hester is acting heteronomously, acting in accordance to the laws and rules that have been laid out for her, as opposed to acting autonomously, the kind of action which Kant would deem moral. Because of this, Hester's morality drops.
Between chapters 7 and 8, Dimmesdale continues to increase and Hester stays the same. Chapter 8, The Elf Child and the Minister. And she may feel, too, what methinks is the very truth, that this boon was meant above all things else to keep the mother's soul alive, and to preserve her from the blacker depths of sin into which Satan might else have thought to plunge that. Dimmesdale's morality increases because he helps Hester keep Pearl on the basis that it is her right as a mother to maintain custody of the child. When applied to the categorical imperative, Dimmesdale's actions are moral because he is upholding his duty to the law, which also coincides with his self-appointed duty to Hester.
Between chapters 8 and 9, Dimmesdale remains the same, whereas Hester undergoes a moral decrease.
Alas, to judge from the gloom and error in the depths of the poor minister's eyes, the battle was a sore one, and the victory anything but secure. 112. Dimmesdale's act of self-mutilation is one in which he is using his body as a means to an end, as we've previously discussed. He wishes to relieve the inner emotional and spiritual turmoil, yet he uses his body and harms it as a means to alleviate the torture. Both his intent and his action are sanctimonious, which results in a moral decrease.
Between chapters 9 and 13, Dimmesdale undergoes a moral decrease. especially between chapters 9 and 10, and then maintains his morality. Hester maintains her morality throughout the entirety of chapters 9 and 13.
Chapter 13, Another View of Hester. The child's own nature often impelled Hester to ask in bitterness of heart whether it were for ill good that the poor little child had been born at all. Here, Hester suggests that death may be preferable to life for both herself and her child Pearl. This morbid suggestion in which Hester degrades life accounts for a decrease in her morality. Of course, this would simply a brief downturn, but this emotional thinking begins her descent towards revealing Chillingworth's identity in the later chapter. This is because she begins to feel the surface-level sympathy and attraction for Dimmesdale. Between chapters 13 and 17, both Hester and Dimmesdale follow a downwards trend.
Chapter 17, The Pastor and His Parishioner. Truth was the one virtue which I might have held fast, and did hold fast to all extremity, save when thy God, thy life, thy fame, were put into question. Then I consented to a deception. But a lie is never good, even though death threaten on the other side. Dost thou not see what I would say? That old man, the physician, he whom they called Roger Chillingworth, he was my husband. Page 169. Hester's revelation of Chillingworth's identity to Dimmesdale violates the categorical imperative and is an emotionally driven action, which is immoral in Kant's standards, resulting in a decrease in her morality and therefore a decrease on the graph.
Between chapters 17 and 18, both Hester and Dimmesdale continue to decrease at the same rate. Chapter 18, A Flood of Sunshine. But this has been a sin of passion, not of principle, nor even purpose. Page 174. A crimson flush was glowing on her cheek that had been so long pale. Her sex, her youth, and the whole richness of her beauty came back from what men called the irrevocable past, and clustered themselves, with her maiden hope, and a happiness before unknown, within the magic circle of this hour. Page 177. Dimmesdale finally reveals himself and his sins to the Puritan society. The society is able to withstand the blow of having their moral pillar degraded by such a heinous sin because they have learned to accept Hester and her attempts at redemption. This revelation constitutes a jump in Dimmesdale's morality because he makes the conscious, rational decision to reveal himself and acts upon it. For arguably the first time in the novel, Dimmesdale's intent is pure, rational, and justified by the categorical imperative.
Between chapters 18 and 20, Hester and Dimmesdale continue to decrease and then plateau.
Chapter 20, The Minister in a Maze. It was, we blush to tell it, to stop short in the road and teach some very wicked words to a knot of little Puritan children who were playing there, and had just begun to talk. Page 192. In this chapter, Dimmesdale's emotions have overtaken his rational thought, causing him to nearly externalize the sins that have been plaguing him throughout the entirety of the novel. This irrational decision is immoral in Kant's standards, and therefore results in a drop in Dimmesdale's morality. Similarly, Dimmesdale's intent has been perverted by the torment of his sins, and thus he reaches one of the lowest points in the entire book. From chapters 20 to 23, Hester and Dimmesdale reach their lowest point in the novel, but in chapter 23, Dimmesdale ascends miraculously to level 10, the apex of his morality.
Chapter 23, The Revelation of the Scarlet Letter. An epic of life more brilliant and full of triumph than any previous one, or that any which could hereafter be. page 216. But he hid it cunningly from men, and walked among you with the mind of a spirit, mournful, because so pure in a sinful world. Page 221. Dimmesdale finally reveals himself and his sins to the Puritan society. The society is able to withstand the blow of having their moral pillar degraded by such a heinous sin because they have learned to accept Hester and her attempts at redemption. This revelation constitutes a jump in Dimmesdale's morality because he makes a conscious, rational decision to reveal himself and acts upon it. For arguably the first time in the novel, Dimmesdale's intent is pure, rational, and justified by the categorical imperative.
Chapter 24, Hester ascends to her highest point as well, following Dimmesdale's path.
Chapter 24, Conclusion. Reverend Dimmesdale, on the very day when Hester first wore her ignominious badge, had begun a course of penance, which he afterward, in so many futile methods, followed out by inflicting a hideous torture upon himself. Page 223. The minister, conscious that he was dying, conscious also that the reverence of the multitude placed him already among saints and angels, had desired, by yielding up his breath in the arms of that fallen woman, to express to the world how utterly nugatory is the choicest of man's own righteousness. Page 224. Here had been her sin, here her sorrow, and here was yet to be her penitence. She had returned, therefore, and resumed, of her own free will. Page 227. Dimmesdale's revelation of his sins inspires the acceptance of sins and transgressions within the Puritan society, which allows Hester to embark on her own journey of embracing her faults and redeeming them. She returns to the Puritan society and gives back, aiding others in their own paths toward redemption. This results in an increase in her graph and maintains Dimmesdale's morality.